Even before the Spanish conquest, the western mountainous part of Colombia attracted the bulk of the population. The more advanced indigenous cultures were found in this region, and the most favorable location for the growth of civilization was the high plateau in the Cordillera Oriental of the Colombian Andes. The present capital city of Bogota is located near the southern terminus of the plateau, which extends northward to the mountains, dividing it from the drainage of the Cesar River. There, the Spanish found the major concentration of the Chibcha-speaking people. At the time of the Spanish conquest, the Chibcha were in the process of consolidation by warfare and had not achieved for union and political institutions. Geographic and climatic conditions placed limits on the development of the Chibcha and the other cultures in Colombia. Of the total indigenous population at the time of the conquest, probably about one-third were Chibcha. None of the other larger domesticated animals and their wild-related species found in the Central Andes existed in Colombia. The Chibcha were craftspeople whose work shows interest and utility in the expression of ideas. European exploration of the Colombian coastline was accomplished by Rodrigo de Bastidas, who in 1500 to 1501 sailed the Caribbean coast from Cape of La Vela to Point Manzanilla in Panama, and by Francisco Pizarro, who sailed the Pacific coast in 1525. The actual conquest of Colombia began in 1525 when Bastidas founded Santa Marta on the north coast. In 1533, Pedro de Heredia founded Cartagena, which is one of the big cities of modern Colombia, which became one of the major naval and merchant marine bases of the Spanish Empire. Bogota was founded by Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada in 1538. By the end of 1539, all but one of the major inland colonial cities had been founded, as well as the most important communication centers along the routes connecting them. By mid-century, the conquest was complete. Establishment of the Audiencia of Santa Fe de Bogota in 1549 opened the colonial era. The conquerors had organized local governments in accordance with the terms of their contract with the crown. The crown then rapidly repossessed the broad powers granted to the conquerors and formed its own institutions to rule the empire. The governments of Popayan, Antioquia, Cartagena, Santa Marta, Rioja, and the new kingdom of Granada, aka Bogota, and the Llanos of Casanare and San Martin were made subject to the new Audiencia. The president was the executive head of government, subject to the viceroy of Peru in administrative matters. The difficulty of travel, however, impeded communications and checked centralized control. The indigenous population of the area declined through the introduction of European diseases and the economic demands made upon them. As elsewhere in the Spanish Empire, the downward trend in population seems to have reversed itself at the end of the 17th and beginning of the 18th century. Acculturation and intermarriage rapidly destroyed most of the special cultural traits of the remaining indigenous people. Subordinate political jurisdictions developed strong regional characteristics as a result of isolation, which fostered intense local loyalties and rivalries. The economy was based on mining and agriculture, but a small yet important textile industry grew up in Socorro, north of Bogota, by the mid-18th century. Slavery was introduced during the conquest and became common in the placer mining areas of the Choco and western Antioquia and in the agricultural regions of the Cauca Valley, the lower Magdalena Valley, and the coastal lowlands. Indigenous persons were treated much like enslaved people. From the early 16th century, they were subject to the encomienda system, requiring tribute in the form of gold or labor. By 1700, mostly privately held encomiendas had reverted to the crown, and they were rarely granted thereafter. But the indigenous population continued to be abused. The viceroyalty of New Granada, which included present-day Colombia, Panama, Venezuela, and Ecuador, was created in 1717-23 and reconstituted in 1740, opening a new era. In the next decades, the crown introduced political and economic measures to reorganize and strengthen the empire by greater centralization of authority, improved administration and communication, and freer development and movement of trade within the empire. Population grew, Trade increased and prosperity touched the colonial subjects. There was a spurt of intellectual activity and the formation of a corps of intellectuals and professional men among Creoles, many in government positions. These small Creole officer corps came into being when Charles III, then King of Spain, authorized militia defense units in the colonies. A relatively large group of wealthy landowners and merchants constituted the economic community that supported these new groups. In 1781, peasants and artisans at Socorro originated the Comunero Rebellion in response to tax increases. Although some Creoles helped lead the rebels to Bogota, most had hesitated to support the uprising or even helped to undermine it. Between 1785 and 1810 in New Granada, the outlook of the Creole upper and middle groups changed from resistance against political and economic change to a quest for specific change in imperial policies. In 1809, they moved toward a free enterprise system, the abolition of slavery, restrictions on government, and worldwide freedom of speech. And trade. Educational reforms played an important role in the changing outlook of the Creoles. One of the biggest Creoles made education one of his main interests. He modernized the program of studies in the schools, opened a school of mines, and initiated the botanical expedition under the able guidance of a naturalist. The new institute trained many of the major figures of the independence movement. The first newspaper and theater were introduced during the 1790s. A new interest in writing developed, and intellectual gatherings for discussion were introduced. In 1808, the allegiance of the Grenadines to the crown remained unquestioned except for a few individuals. The once warm loyalty of the Creole middle and upper classes, however, was cooling under the pressure of economic interests, scandals in the royal family, and persistent social tension between Creoles and European Spaniards. In the Napoleonic Wars, the French invasion of Spain in 1808 caused an outburst of loyalty to the king and country and excited grave concern for the church. Profound Grenadine anxiety over the fate of the empire and conflicting courses of action attempted by colonial and peninsular subjects over control of government during the captivity of the Spanish King Ferdinand VII led to strife in New Granada and to declarations of independence. In 1810, the subordinated jurisdictions in New Granada threw out their Spanish officials, except in Santa Marta and what are now Panama and Ecuador. The uprising in Bogota on July 20th, 1810 is commemorated as Independence Day in Colombia. Although these new governments swore allegiance to Ferdinand VII and did not begin to declare independence until 1811, idealist and ambitious provincial leaders desired federation. Creole leaders sought to centralize authority over the new governments. A series of civil wars ensued, facilitating Spanish reconquest of the United Provinces of New Granada during 1814 and 1816. A remnant of Republican forces fled, where they reorganized under Francisco de Paula Santander, a Colombian general who remained a prominent figure in Grenadine policies and politics until his death in 1840. Any remaining loyalty to the crown was alienated by the punitive, arbitrary conduct of the European and partisan troops, whose actions gave validity to the attack on Spanish civilization that began late in 1810 and continued through the 19th century. The rebel forces in Casanare joined those of Simón Bolivar in the Orinoco basin of Venezuela. By 1819, arrangements for a regular government were completed, and a constitutional convention met at Angostura, now Ciudad Bolivar in Venezuela, with delegates from other cities and provinces throughout the Colombia and Venezuela. And in that same year, Bolivar invaded Colombia and decisively defeated the Spanish forces on August 7th at Boyaca. There followed the decisive Battle of Caraboco, Venezuela, in 1821, and that of Pichincha, Ecuador, in 1822. Mopping up operations were completed in 1823, while Bolivar led his forces on to Peru. The Congress of Angostura laid the foundation for the formation of the Republic of Colombia from 1819 to 1830, which was generally known as Gran Colombia because it included what are now the separate countries of Colombia, Panama, Ecuador, and Venezuela. The Republic was definitively organized by the Congress of Cucuta in 1821. Prior to that time, the government was highly military and hierarchically organized, with regional vice presidents exercising direct power, while its president, Bolivar, was campaigning. Organized as a centralized representative government, the republic retained Bolivar as president and acting president, Santander as vice president. Gran Colombia had a brief virile existence during the war. Subsequent civilian and military rivalry for public office and regional jealousies led in 1826 to a rebellion in Venezuela. Bolivar returned from Peru to restore unity, but secured only the acknowledgement of his personal authority. As discontent spread, it became clear that no group loved the republic enough to fight for its existence. By 1829, Bolivar had divided the land into 4 jurisdictions under Venezuelan generals possessing civil and military authority. Meanwhile, the convention at Ocana had failed to reorganize the republic, and the brief dictatorship of Bolivar had no better success. Bolivar then convoked the convention of 1830, which produced a constitution honored only in New Granada, the name then referring only to Colombia with the Isthmus of Panama. During this convention, Bolivar resigned and left for the northern coast, where he died near Santa Marta on December 17, 1830. By that time, Venezuela and Ecuador had seceded from Gran Colombia. New Granada, a country of 1.5 million inhabitants in 1835, was left on its own. Santander, the vice president under Bolivar and then leader of the opposition to Bolivar's imperial demands, in 1828, held the presidency from 1832 to 1837 and was the dominant political figure of that era. The 1830s brought some prosperity to the new nation, but the civil war that broke out in 1840 ended nascent industrial development, disrupted trade, and discouraged local enterprise. The seed of political rivalry between liberals and conservatives had already been sown, and they bore fruit in the bloody revolution and costly violence that ravaged the country in the years between 1840 and 1903. Colombia's modern political history began in the late 1840s with the delineation of the liberal and conservative parties. During the first conservative president's term, from 1845 to 1849, he replaced the government monopoly on tobacco sales with a private monopoly and expanded international trade. These changes increased the production and export of tobacco, but reduced the tax income of the national government. In 1849, a general of the radical faction of the Liberal Party then became president. It was his task to implement the reforms passed in 1850, which galvanized political sentiment and divided the country politically and economically for half a century. The guiding principle of the radical liberals under the president was greater liberty for the people of Colombia. His government ended slavery, ended indigenous peoples' communal ownership of land, diverted tax resources from the central to local governments, and eliminated a number of taxes and monopolies held by the central government. Rather than eliminate the institutional barriers to self-fulfillment by the people, however, the reforms of 1850 tended to eliminate the traditional proscriptions that had stood as safeguards against the exploitation of the poor by the rich. The reforms, despite the liberal rhetoric that accompanied them, legalized, indeed, encouraged, and a redistribution of landed property and tended to strengthen the position of the wealthy landowners, merchants, and professionals against the massive poor indigenous people, peasants, and artisans. Since there were only about 25,000 enslaved people in a country of 2 million, the effects of manumission were small compared with those of the breakdown of the indigenous communist system, which affected a third of the population. The indigenous people were induced to give up their little plots of land and the small amount of independence they enjoyed. Within a few years, of ownership of the land of indigenous people was concentrated in a few hands. The indigenous people had become tenants, their land used for grazing cattle. While class conflict seethed under the surface in Colombian society, the struggle between merchants and groups within the elite was more open. 2 issues in particular divided the upper class. First, whether a centralist or federalist political system would be the best arrangement for Colombia, and second, what role was appropriate for the Roman Catholic Church, and particularly for its clerics in Colombian society. Adherents of federalism were strongest in the years between 1863 and 1880, during which time the country was called the United States of Colombia. Subsequent government publications were to refer to that period as the epoch of civil wars. In 51 of the 240 months that passed in the 1860s and 1870s, there was some form of civil conflict taking place within the country. The Colombian army was so small that public order could not be maintained. The power of the anti-clerical faction reached a peak in the early 1860s. A revolutionary government headed church lands in 1861, and a constitution adopted in 1863 guaranteed freedom of religious practice, thus bringing to the end the traditional intimate relationship between church and state in Colombia. Both actions were reversed during the period of regeneration from 1880 to 1895, and the conservatives who followed the new president. After further civil conflict in the 1880s, the conservative leader was able to promulgate a new constitution in 1886 to reestablish relations with the Vatican via the Concordat of 1887 and to promote some internal improvements in industrial development. But the political struggle between liberals and conservatives was far from over. Armed civil conflict reached its peak in the War of 1,000 Days from 1899 to 1903. The estimates of the number of deaths in that struggle ranged from 60,000 to 130,000. The devastating civil war was followed by the loss of Panama. The Colombian Congress refused an offer from the United States to build a canal across the isthmus, and in 1903 the Panamanians revolted against the government in Bogota. They negotiated a treaty with the United States that created a canal zone 10 miles wide under the U.S. sovereignty in exchange for an agreement by the United States to build a canal and to provide a very regular annual payment to Panama. Although the U.S. government later agreed to pay $25 million to Colombia, the episode embittered Colombian-U.S. relations for many years. Colombia's internal development quickened after 1905, with coffee exports expanding by nearly 10% per year between 1909 and 1928. At the beginning of the 20th century, Colombia supplied about 3% of world coffee exports. By 1923, its share had risen to nearly 10%. In the late 1920s, coffee accounted for nearly one-fifth of Colombia's entire GDP. The new dependence on exports was not without its pitfalls. In the late 1920s, coffee, petroleum, and bananas accounted for, respectively, 69%, 17%, and 6% of the total Colombian exports, and all three dropped precipitously in value during the worldwide Great Depression of the 1930s. Rapid industrial development started in the 1930s. Medellin became the principal producer of cotton textiles and other fabrics. The limited availability of imports during the Depression was a major factor that enabled local manufacturing to get its start. Throughout the next several decades, guerrilla groups, dictators, and small-scale civil wars sparked partly due to either the liberal or conservative elected leaders of the country and their policies. Such groups as the Colombian Revolutionary Armed Forces in 1964, which is inspired by communism seen in the Soviet Union and Cuba, and later after this 1970 election, the 19th of April movement, who two precious historical objects such as Simon Bolivar's sword, but in the mid-70s it would change. The process of change brought with it new political, economic, and social problems, which stemmed from uneven development, unequal gains, and a growing perception that the benefits of higher income were not widely shared. Since 1974, limited progress had been made on those issues. However, the Colombian economy has grown despite pervasive violence, fed both by guerrilla insurgencies and traffic in narcotics. As the National Front era was ending, a new problem surfaced in Colombia: narcotics. The country's role as a supplier in the international drug market developed rapidly following the major interdiction efforts launched by officials in Mexico in 1975. Colombia soon was providing as much as 7/10 of the marijuana being imported into the United States. Using the profits from marijuana, drug leaders, especially from Medellin, diversified to cocaine trafficking, and shipments grew from individuals carrying small amounts to large quantities on boats and low-flying airplanes. Two major mafia-like organizations, dubbed drug cartels, evolved from this illicit, lucrative trade. The first in Medellin, led by Pablo Escobar, and the second in Cali, which is a city in Colombia. The next few presidents only grew that power of the drug groups, who kidnapped many high-ranking Colombian people, like the Supreme Court, tested Colombia's long-term commitment to democracy, and the overall power that drug traffickers have by showing the inability of the government to control terrorist activities. In the following years, Colombia strove to control their economy and ensure eventual growth with a new economic order that increases freedoms on civilians and resudes the role of the government in the economy and made a new constitution. In the year 2000, the U.S. Congress approved a controversial aid program that supplied Colombia with military assistance to help control the cocaine trade. The FARC continued to expand cocaine production. Well, however, and economic uncertainties and the specter of political violence remained major issues at the end of the president's term. A new president, who was elected in 2002, on promises to end a long-standing and violent conflict with guerrilla groups and restore security to the country. In December 2003, a peace agreement was negotiated between the government and the AUC, and by 2004, AUC members had disarmed. Some members of the FARC and the ELN gave up their weapons as well in exchange for a lighter punishment. In 2004, the Colombian Congress amended the constitution to allow a president to serve a second term, setting the stage for the president's re-election in 2006. And then the super modern day, Colombia is the second largest South American nation by population and has a growing economy. But the drug problem, like Mexico, keeps growing larger, but the future for Colombia could be very positive. That is it for the history of Colombia.